You can click on all of them, Laura. Thank you. So you might be wondering, what do these pictures have to do with language access at all, right? Now, I chose these pictures for very specific reasons. These pictures show how in unideal circumstances, things can grow, right? So when we think of this, I want you to think about your current position, whether it's a parent or a professional, how language access in its current situation can grow from where it is, right? So in unideal situations, we can make something grow. So I invite everyone to a brave space. Together, we will create a brave space because there is no such thing as a safe space. We exist in a real world where we carry scars and we all have caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it would be our brave space together. And we work on it side by side. So this is a conversation, right, that we can build on, this brave space and having the opportunity to listen to other people and their lived experiences when it comes to language access, right? And this is an opportunity to have this brave space where we can have this discussion about language access and support each other and make changes based off of what, our panelists are going to share today. Next slide, Laura. So what is language access? Language access is when an individual who does not dominate English very well or at all are able to have meaningful access to benefits, a wide range of services, and information on important aspects of programs and activities. These are some of the laws that we are going to briefly discuss. Civil Rights Act of 1964, specifically Title VI, Equal Educational Opportunities Act, IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, Americans with Disabilities Act, and of course the CT Multilingual Language Learner Bill of Rights. So Title VI. Title VI states, right, that any entity that receives federal funding has to provide meaningful access via interpretation, translation of documents, and mode of communication. And it's a different type of mode of communication than Americans with Disabilities Act, and we'll discuss that in a minute. Equal Educational Opportunities Act says that we have to remove language barriers to provide equal educational opportunities for students. Americans with Disabilities Act focuses on mode of communication. IDEA is specific to special education, and it says that we have to provide prior written notice. This is specific to an IEP, procedural safeguards, consent, interpretation at parent PPT meetings, planning and placement team meetings. And specific to Connecticut, we have to provide notice of an invitation to a PPT, and then we have the Parents' Bill of Rights. Now, I think it's important to note that Title VI and Equal Educational Opportunities Act are civil rights laws that focus on discrimination, right, and equal access to education. IDEA and Connecticut regulations have specific requirements regarding language access. It is important to know that students with disabilities and their families maintain their civil rights regardless of identification, right? So these laws work together, not in silos. Title VI and Equal Education Opportunities Law apply to both general and special education students and their families. So who is a limited English proficient individual or an English language learner? This is an individual who does not dominate the English language in any of these areas. It could be reading, speaking, writing, comprehending English. So the law references limited English proficient individual. However, that can be an English language learner, right? Someone that does not dominate the English language. Now, there are some things to consider when we think about a person who is an English language learner, right? We have to consider what areas are they having difficulties with. Laura, next slide. I'm sorry. Thank you. So when we look at those areas, whether it's reading, writing, understanding, right, and speaking, there's some things to consider. For the parent, they need to consider their areas that they have difficulties with, right? Because some parents can be able to speak English, but maybe not read it, right? Some families may be able to understand it, but not express themselves in English, and they need to express themselves in their language, right? So it's important not to make assumptions about where we are as a parent or as a professional. It's important that families, right, parents, guardians, and students identify their areas that they do dominate and the areas that they don't, so that they can inform the staff on how they need to be communicated with so they can have meaningful participation. Same way that school staff, right, the way that they can engage parents, students, is by asking parents if they need interpretation translation services so that they can better be engaged in their students' education. And it builds trust and relationships, right, which we focus, that helps family engagement. Needs to meaningfully participate. The parent needs to communicate what are their needs to meaningfully participate. It may be that this specific parent, right, because meaningful participation is individualized, because any of those areas that individual is not dominant in will need support, but that doesn't mean that they need support in all of those areas, right? Because like I said, some families can understand it, but they may need to speak it in their language, may need to be able to express themselves in their language. So it's important that when we're talking and communicating with our teachers and counselors, that as parents and students, we share that information about what our needs are, that we can be meaningfully, so that we can meaningfully participate. And as professionals, we need to meet parents where they are. And if they're not asking, right, and we're seeing those areas of difficulty, or that there's some miscommunication, making that offer of asking parents if they need translation interpretation or what is their mode of communication. Now, Title VI that I had mentioned before talked about mode of communication. I had mentioned that it does have a component of mode of communication. So Title VI, when we talk about mode of communication, it is more about, does that family, maybe that family has difficulty in reading, so do they prefer to be spoken to orally or shared information with orally versus in writing? Americans with Disabilities Act focuses more on the mode of communication, right? If a person has a visual impairment, does that mean that we need to provide information in Braille or in large print? And this should also include sign language. And one component also, when we're considering dominant language, high stress situations like meetings, like PPT meetings, right? Planning and placement team meetings or discipline meetings, can diminish the amount that a family understands or that a parent understands, because it is a high stress emotional situation. So it's important that both parties, whether it's a professional or parent and student, that we advocate for our school team, right? That we're sharing this information, that this parent might need these type of supports, and you as a parent sharing what type of supports do you need to be fully engaged in your child's education. Next slide. So although we talked about laws that are related to language access, right? And that is a responsibility, right? It is also the right thing to do, right? This builds meaningful participation for families, right? Communication is a basic human need. When families can understand and communicate effectively with schools, they are more likely to be engaged in their child's education. This engagement, in turn, has been shown to improve student outcomes, as parents can support learning at home, attend school events, and advocate for their children. Meaningful access is ensuring that parents, guardians, and students with limited English proficiency have the necessary language resources to fully engage in the educational process. This means they can understand important information, participate in discussion, communicate their thoughts, and contribute to the decision-making related to the student's education. The goal is to remove language barriers, allowing all parties to be informed and actively involved in shaping educational outcomes for students. This can be done through services such as interpretation, translation, and/or mode of communication. Family engagement, right? By gaining the interest of families where they understand the information that is being shared, parents are empowered when they know there are active participants in their child's education. It also closes educational gaps. When you are informed, you make informed decisions. Informed decision-making can only occur when you are communicated with, and parents are communicated with, in their language or mode of communication. Then and only then can anyone make informed decisions to benefit their children or the student. So take a moment to think about how this may affect you in the educational setting as a professional or as a parent. Also think about the possibility of missed opportunities due to lack of being informed of educational opportunities. So equal educational opportunities, when you're able to communicate with your child's team, that being medical or education, early intervention, in your language, you are better equipped to explain and express concerns and suggestions and ask questions pertaining to your child. This improves the outcomes of your child. For example, some examples of equal educational opportunities, right, is understanding that there could be non-academic events, for example, school dances, right? Participation in sports, participation at school events, training, AP classes, right? All students, regardless of language barriers, should be able to take part in educational opportunities. And the only way this can be done if the parent is informed of these opportunities so that they can counsel their child on these opportunities to make informed decisions. And again, as I said, it is a legal responsibility. Are there any questions up to this point? I can't see the chat. Is there anything? Okay.
I don't see anything in the chat, but our student panelists came in and I just want to make sure we're all set for the language selection for her.
Okay. Lily, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. At the bottom of your screen, by chance, do you see an icon that looks like a globe? Are you joining us from a cell phone or a computer?
Cell phone.
Okay, so on your cell phone, there should be 3 little dots, like a more section.
Yep. All
And then
right.
you should be able to see then an icon to select a language, a little globe.
Yeah.
Okay, so you can select English and then mute the original audio.
Okay.
Okay. Can you hear me fine?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So now we are going to move on to our panelists. Each panelist, I'll go through the list of the panelists and everyone can introduce yourself, your name, a little bit about yourself and your role today at today's panel session. So Laura, for here, I think we could just stop the slide so then that way we can all see each other. Thank you. Thank you, and thank you for joining us. So I will start just from the way my screen is. I'll start with Ada.
I get to go first. Hi, everyone. I'm Ada Kovachikuma. I actually moved to Connecticut. So I was born and raised in Albania. I moved here when I was 14. I actually attended, so I finished out my 8th grade at Naylor in Hartford and then moved on to Buckley. And then after that, I actually graduated from Rocky Hill High. So did some moving around in Connecticut during those first years. And I have had the pleasure of working and graduating college here, multiple degrees, and then have worked as the Albanian interpreter for the state of Connecticut for quite a few years. And then on to education. And where I currently am, actually, I am I work for the State Department of Ed as an education consultant in the performance office.
Thank you, Ada. Thank you very much. And for the next one who's on my screen, I have Lily.
Hello. I'm Lily. And I'm 20 years old, and I am actually legally blind. And I go to Highlander Transition Academy, and I'm from Connecticut.
Thank you, Lily. Next on my screen is Yukio.
Great. Hello, everyone. My name is Yukio Ida, and I am a parent leader from West Hartford. I moved to the suburbs of Chicago back in the 80s when I was in 3rd grade. So it was the 1900s back then. And I went to a predominantly white public school and went through the American public school system from 3rd grade on. So, and I am currently a parent of a public school child, but she is, US born and American citizen. And previous to my current position, I was a public school teacher at the high school level. So I've been a student as an ESL learner, and then I was a teacher in a public school working with families and students that were multilingual. And now I am a parent of a child who is in the public school system. So education has been a part of my life for a very long time. So thank you.
Thank you, Yukio. And then the next one on my screen is Rosa. Tienes el micrófono apagado, Rosa. Your microphone is off. You're muted.
Buenos días, mi nombre es Rosa Torres, soy de Perú. ¿Lo tengo que decir en inglés o me escucha?
Okay.
¿Me está escuchando o no?
The interpreter is saying it in English for you.
Okay, entonces, soy originaria de Perú, entonces mi idioma es el español. Tengo 3 hijos, vivo, que ya están ya adolescentes y uno de ellos tiene necesidades especiales, entonces, realmente mi participación en este momento es como madre, ¿no? De los 3, obviamente, con sus diferentes necesidades, porque los típicos también tienen muchas necesidades, y como madre que no domina el idioma inglés, pues me interesa mucho este tipo de reuniones.
Thank you very much, Rosa. And I thank you for the panelists for being here. You all have a different lived experience, right? With language access, which they're different, but they're all part of language access, right? So this is why you're here, to have and share that lived experience and to share what has worked, what hasn't worked. So I'm going to ask some questions, you know, based off of what you've lived and how it relates to language access. So I know that when you moved here, you already spoke English, right?
Yes, I was lucky enough because my mother was an English teacher in Albania, so I did have quite a bit of the language acquisition. And even though I was actually placed in ESL when I first got here, but was able to test out fairly quickly.
Thank you. Now, in your experience, right, you were here and you knew the language, right? What were some of the difficulties that you experienced regarding language access, in not necessarily that you couldn't understand the language or read or speak it, but where were your difficulties moving here and speaking the language?
Yeah, so I think most people, when it comes to language acquisition and just language and overall, talk about just the aspect of understanding, reading, writing. They forget sometimes that language is that bridge between cultures, right? So the cultural aspects, no one prepares you when you move to a new country, or at least no one prepared me at the age of 14 moving to a new country, what that meant, even from the little things about walking into a classroom, and it just looked very different than my previous classroom. I was used to sharing a desk or our benches with someone else, versus here I was sitting by myself, and I had not had the pleasure of a desk that actually came attached to my seat, which is like sometimes, so see, I see you feel like laughing. I mean, it was like those little things that I didn't know how to get into my seat in 8th grade. I mean, I know it sounds kind of silly now, and as I reminisce, and I tell my daughter, who's a senior in high school, and she looks at me and she's like, what do you mean? I was like, yes. I was like, it's very different. I was like, it looks different. Even now, when I would go back to Albania, it looks different now too. But it was like those simple things that you just don't realize. The cultural differences, it's like those pieces, I think, that sort of go untold.
I'm trying to find my own mute button, sorry. Thank you for sharing that. Now to do a little deeper dive. Now, how could, in understanding those cultural differences, right? How did it impact any part of your education experience, whether it be equal educational opportunities or just general education, as far as understanding that, you know, I think one of the things that we discussed, right, was some of the fluffiness of conversation that happens here that may not happen so much in, you know, where you're from. So can you share a little bit of how that could have impacted or did impact in any way?
Well, so it's kind of funny, right? Because I come from a culture that is very direct. So it's never, even in conversations, you never get that fluff. You get the hello, how are you? Kiss on both cheeks in those cases where we know each other very well, but you don't get the fluff of in our, and when I say our, like our American culture, like we still have like certain pleasantries that you go through before you ask for something, versus an Albanian, I need something, I need to get to the point, so therefore I'm going to ask you what I need. It's not about getting you to understand where I'm coming from, and like sometimes the runaround. So it's very, because of that directness, that directness, it makes it very difficult. So when my mother spoke the language, it made it very difficult to, if she was going to my school and asking for something because she needed information, she just got to the point and said, well, I need this. And it was like, well, hold on a second, you're being very forward. hold on, let's try to calm down. We're like, what do you mean calm down? We're speaking very normally. Like, this is just, yes, we speak with our hands. Yes, we're very expressive. Yes, our volume might be raised, but it's not that we're shouting at you. Like, this is just normal conversation, right? And then you don't realize sometimes that those nuances of the cultural aspect of who you're speaking with, right? It's and I get it. In having worked in Hartford previously, we were dealing with over 98 different languages, right? Just spoken in the district. So because of that, now we're talking about just as many, if not more, cultures, because not the same language is spoken in multiple countries, and therefore multiple cultures. So it's those pieces that make it a bit more difficult than it has to be sometimes.
I completely agree with you. And I thank you for sharing that piece, right? Because although the law says what is language access, right, there are some things that are gray. Some things are black and white and some things are not, right? And for this specific example is that when we're speaking to families or when families are speaking, their culture comes with that language, right? So for professionals, they might see it as being rude and being forward and direct when it's just the norm for someone else. So it's important that we bring up that piece. So when we are dealing with families, right, that as professionals, that you understand that they may not be coming off as rude, right? And asking clarifying questions might help support and engage that relationship and build that relationship up, not just assuming that a parent is being rude or being forward, right? Because culture plays a big role in language. And it's same thing for the parent, right? It's important that because we're here, right, that we understand that sometimes we might have to add certain things to our language so that it doesn't come off that way. Not that I'm saying that anyone should change how we are, right? But the same way that the staff need to accommodate and maybe make clarifying questions, we need to make some adjustments when we're possibly in our speech. But just that is such a big aspect of language access, is understanding that those cultures meet and we're dealing with so many different cultures. So thank you. That is a wealth of knowledge in that aspect, right? Because it is just really, really important. Thank you for that. Yukio, for you, you shared that you moved here when you were in third grade, right? Did you know the language when you moved here?
I didn't, well, I had some background in it because I did live in Australia for 1 year when I was in kindergarten. But when you're that young, you're really quick to pick up the language, but you're also quick to forget it if you don't use it. And so even though I was in Australia for a year, when I came to the US in third grade, I was back at zero again. So everything was new. And when you think about Australian English and American English, there's different ways of saying things, and different idioms and all those colloquialisms. So
Thank you. And did you, when your parents moved, did they have knowledge of the language or no?
my dad spoke some because of his work, but my mom didn't have the language skills. And if you also think about the traditional roles of a mom and dad, right? My dad had work English knowledge. And again, this also goes with the cultural stuff, but he had no understanding of the American US system and the culture and the practices around it. So even though he may have been able to speak English in his work setting, there was a lot of English content knowledge that was missing from the school environment.
Thank you. Thank you. And I wonder how, coming to a new country, right? A different education system, right? Because everything is very, very different here. How did you see them struggle with language barriers when it came to registering you for school, for going to parent teacher conferences, right? Did you see any struggles with that with your family?
Yeah, I think to a certain extent, because there weren't that many of us, meaning like there weren't that many immigrants or folks that had limited English language abilities. Um, I think the school was patient, right? Because this is something that they didn't have to do a lot on a daily basis.
Mhm.
So they were, I think, pretty patient with my parents when it came to stuff like registration or my parents needing to meet with the teachers. And this was also back in the days where we didn't have Google Translate. And so we had like, I remember my parents showing up to school events with um, an English to Japanese dictionary and also, right, the opposite, Japanese to English. Oh, they had like multiple dictionaries in hand to try to navigate, all these different conversations that they were trying to have with teachers. So it took a lot longer in communicating, right? Even like, how is my child doing with homework? Right? That flow of conversation and the speed with which information was being exchanged by the different parties took a while.
I bet. I bet. And all of the information that probably was missed, right?
Yes.
Because at that point
Yeah.
you're trying to throw out the most important things, right?
Yes.
So all of those little pieces that could have been missed, right? Because most likely were missed, right?
Yeah.
Imagine trying to understand report cards or any of that information that really gave useful information about how you were doing in school, right? That information that is so
Yeah.
important for us to know and be engaged. Even if you are
Yes.
even if you are a parent that is there at these meetings and trying to get information, you're still struggling with being engaged because, right, it's hard to be engaged when you are not understanding the language or you're
Right.
getting bits and pieces of it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's so important that, right, that's where that engagement piece is and meeting parents where they are, right? I can't even imagine what it would be like to have to go to a meeting with a dictionary and trying to figure out bits and pieces of a conversation through a dictionary,
Right.
right? So thank you, Yukio. That's
Yes.
really important. Thank you. Rosa, ¿me escuchas? Rosa, en tu experiencia, I'm sorry, I'm going into Spanish. I'm sorry. Let me switch this up. I apologize, Lady Ango Alba. Rosa, have you experienced a time when the language barrier has impacted understanding your child's education, whether it's general education or special education?
Sí, al yo haber venido ya adulta acá y a aprender el idioma y pues tuve mis hijos, voy a hablar específicamente de mi hijo que tiene necesidades especiales, que tiene autismo. Entonces yo estaba en una reunión y yo pensaba que ya hablaba mm, suficiente para entender. Y me dijeron que mi hijo había mejorado mucho y yo me alegré y firmé unos papeles pensando de que, bueno, me han dado una buena noticia y me fui muy contenta a la casa. Y ahí le tocaba una terapia a mi hijo. Y le comenté a la terapista porque como ya llevaba ya 2 años de terapia con mi hija, ya pues mi hijo ya nos tratábamos con más cercanía y le conté lo que pasó y ella me dijo, ¿has firmado? ¿Qué papel has firmado? Me dijo. Y entonces yo le enseñé y ella me dice, ahora tu hijo no va a tener has renunciado a todas las terapias de tu hijo. Entonces yo entendí una parte y no entendí una parte muy fundamental, que al decirme que mi hijo estaba supuestamente mejor, yo renunciaba a las terapias que mi hijo tenía. Entonces ella me tradujo y me dijo, tienes una semana para decir, no, me equivoqué y llamar. En ese instante llamé y dije, no, quiero otra reunión, yo me equivoqué, no entendí bien. Y entonces, eh, obviamente en ese momento me di cuenta de que, o sea, tienes que entender claramente cada cosa, sobre todo de tus hijos, sobre todo de cualquiera de ellos, también de mis otros dos niños que no tienen necesidades especiales, porque no entender o malentender una palabra puede cambiar mucho, ¿no? Por las situaciones.
Thank you, Rosa. Thank you. Now I can't, I can imagine, right, having a child who does is receiving special education, how that would make me feel, right? This is why one of the things we want to support families is in identifying where their strengths and weaknesses lie when it comes to understanding English, so that they can be forthcoming with that information, so that they're not having, right, to get these notices, right, signing a document without even knowing what you're signing, right? Or being honest to say, I thought I understood, I don't fully understand. Let's go back to have a conversation with an interpreter and translate this information for me. Because we are missing out on key important information. With that being shared, I recently attended a meeting with a parent who had a meeting with a special education teacher, and it was completely in English, right? And when we went to the PPT, the teacher was like, "You need an interpreter?" We discussed draft goals and objectives last week, and you were fine, right? And mom had no idea that they had discussed draft goals and objectives. She thought it was just a conversation. So that level, being honest of what is your level of understanding in English, and conversational English is very, very different than talking about draft goals and objective, right? Or really a discipline meeting, talking about interventions. Those are different types of meetings that they might be using language, jargon, educational language, jargon that we don't understand in another language, right? Even in English, it's hard for us to understand and follow. So adding the barrier of language, that is going to impact, right? And like I mentioned before, the importance of the meeting, the stress level of that meeting, right? I know for IEPs, PPT meetings, not so much now, but early on, weeks before, I was a nervous wreck, right? So imagine being at that meeting and your level of understanding diminishes because you are on high alert, you are stressed, right? So, I want families to feel empowered to share that they are needing support in whatever of those areas are, whether it's understanding, speaking, writing, that they are reading, that they share that information so that you can have better information and understand more about your child's education. Thank you, Rosa. Thank you. So Lily, right, as I said, you all have a very a lens, a lived experience regarding language access. So you shared that you have a visual impairment. What does that mean when anyone communicates with you, as far as writing? What does that mean?
So, because I am legally blind and have CVI, they can't just put it on a piece of paper in 11-inch font. They have to send it to me in an email on 18 to 24, and it has to be double spaced because for me, things look very distorted. So I don't understand it if it's not double spaced. And I have to tell my teachers that so they understand, because not everybody understands what a visual impairment is.
Thank you, Lily. And that a visual impairment, right, is different for everyone, right?
Because
So
that's a spectrum. So you can have, I only have central vision and no peripheral, but somebody can only have light perception. So it varies between person to person.
thank you, Lily. So when you are receiving an email, Lily, do you read it, or are you looking for assistive technology to read it to you? Or there's both, a
Um,
combination?
It's a little bit of both. So some days I can read it by myself, and some days I have to use like my voiceover or computer's text to speech to read it to me.
And have you ever had an experience in when you were unable to meaningfully participate in any aspect of your education, whether it be special education, accommodations, general education, because that information was not provided to you in that way?
Yes, like flyers, like they never sent them out in an email. Somebody had to read them to me, and sometimes they didn't get read to me. Like I missed out on like a school dance my first year of high school. And I personally felt like I didn't really belong in that community because nobody was really hearing what I needed.
Thank you, Lily. Now, in I know what about in PPT meetings, how your IEP or any information that was very important to you as far as those meetings? Was that information shared in the way that you requested?
I personally think that teachers should read it through, like the IEP, so they know. Like one accommodation I had to like keep reminding people is please email this to me. I can't read it. And I just felt like giving up on the teachers because I shouldn't have to repeat myself 37 different times. But I know that they have 30 kids. So of course they're going to need reminders, but I personally think like they should know that.
Thank you. Thank you, especially, right, because you shared that you needed this information in your language to meaningfully participate, right?
Yes.
I see how you would feel like, what's the point of me asking if I continue to ask and I'm not getting it, right?
Mhm.
Now, you did share, I remember when we were conversating in preparation for this meeting, you did share that there was a time that information had been given to you, right? And there was someone who was specifically helping you with that, and that had taken the time to do that and did the effort and how it made you feel. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I had a special education teacher that always kept an eye out for certain events for me, like school dances and stuff, so I could like get the invite. Like there was a pep rally and stuff, and I wanted to go, and she was telling me about it, and I got a chance to go because I had somebody tell me, and that made me feel really good that somebody took the time to communicate that to me.
And that your voice was heard, right? That she took the time to say, hey, this is what's happening, right? Because that is part of an equal educational opportunity, that you can belong in all aspects of that education, like the pep rally and the dance, right?
Because just
Um,
because you have a disability doesn't mean that you shouldn't go to things.
yes, I completely agree. I completely agree with you, Lily. Thank you, Lily. So I'm going to circle back and ask, right? We had some to dive a little bit further into some of your lived experiences. Rosa, was there a time, I mean, you did share that your child, you could have been impacted by signing that consent form and signing that consent form, right? And having someone support you in translating it for you, and you being able to say, hey, I need to have a meeting to discuss this, right? Can you share how that has changed the way you approach now, seeing that you do need support, you do need interpretation translation services? How has that now impacted how you maneuver or navigate your meetings and education as a whole for your son?
Bueno, es obviamente ante lo que pasó, tuve que hacer rápidamente decir, ok, mi nivel de inglés no es suficiente, me puedo desenvolver en otras áreas, pero esta área tengo que ser muy cuidadosa, hay muchas palabras que no entiendo y acá, gracias a Dios, logré contactarme con CIPAC, que ahora me acompañan a los PPTs y entonces es una enorme diferencia porque entiendo todo eso, esos detalles que yo pensaba incluso cuando la primera vez que fui con CIPAC a la reunión, al PPT, me di cuenta de que las cosas no estaban como yo pensaba, o sea, que mi idea de cómo estábamos con mi hijo estaba muy alejada de la realidad. Mi hijo no había tenido una evaluación hace 3 años actualizada y eso yo no lo había captado. Entre todo lo que hablaban, yo no había captado eso. Entonces fue como que alguien prendió la luz en un cuarto y se hizo la luz. Pude ver muchas cosas, yo solo entendía lo grueso y no entendía los detalles que son tan fundamentales para el desarrollo de mi hijo, para que lo puedan ayudar en este momento que es crucial. Entonces, yo realmente, ese momento que pasé, yo lo agradezco mucho porque fue como el jalón que yo necesitaba de orejas para ubicarme. Porque a veces cuando hablamos el idioma estamos empezando y nos desenvolvemos en otras áreas y la gente nos entiende, pensamos que, ok, yo puedo con esto, pero no. Cuando se trata de la educación, hay palabras, como dijo, que son específicas para esa área, que uno necesita tener a alguien que le apoye para realmente entender el contexto de lo que está sucediendo y poder tomar decisiones importantes para la vida de nuestros hijos, ¿no? Que le van a impactar en su vida. Y entonces, si uno lo sigue diciendo, oh, no, yo entiendo, y pasando una reunión a otra reunión, uno va a dejar de tomar oportunidades, va a dejar de poner claridad en los asuntos que se tiene que trabajar más. Entonces, para mí hay una gran diferencia ahora que tengo el apoyo de CIPAC en cada reunión, ¿no? En todos los aspectos del desarrollo de mi hijo.
Thank you, Rosa. Thank you, Rosa. Now, Yukio, I know you mentioned a interesting situation or a funny story. If you'd like to share that story with us, I think it would highlight some of what Rosa and all of us have been talking about.
Sure, yeah. A lot of flyers, right, come home. A lot of information come home. And again, this was back in the 1900s where Rizzo machines were making copies. So a lot of papers came home. And again, my parents with their multiple dictionaries tried to really figure out what each flyer said or, each piece of communication from the teacher said. And it was a certain point where, I was old enough and I understood, right, the language much better than my parents did. And I also learned how to do cursive at that point. So I just, I got a little tired of having to help my parents work through all the paperwork. And so I was like, oh, well, I'll just sign my own field trip permission form. I am tired of having to go through each individual piece of paper with my parents. So I'm really sorry, teachers, but I did sign permission slips for field trips at a certain point, and that was that.
Thank you, Yukio. I mean, and we're laughing, right? Because it is funny, right? But I want to highlight this could have been a complete different document that was being signed, right?
Yes.
It could have been discipline. It could have been suspension.
Yes.
It could have been consent for
Detention,
evaluations.
yes.
Yeah, it could have been denial of special education, right? That you're denying services.
Right.
So in this funny situation, right? Because it is funny, right? But think about how this is information that other students are possibly doing now, right? Because
Right.
the work that it takes to have to do that, right, and explain and possibly re-explain, right, it's just easier to just sign it and make that judgment call at 10, 11, 12, 13 years old, right?
Yeah.
It's also, I mean, reality is that we've all been there, right? We don't want to get in trouble when we get home if we did something wrong at school, right? So imagine getting a detention or suspension and your mom having to sign, you're like, oh, I can sign this, and right. So I brought that, thank you for sharing, Yukio, because I wanted to highlight how many times this is truly happening and we don't even know about it, right? That's why information needs to be shared with the parent in their mode of communication, whether it's email, whether it's a phone call, right? Understanding what that mode of communication is for that family, right? There's often an assumption that we all can read, we all can spell, we all, right? And that is not the case, So understanding that we need to meet families where they are. Is this family requiring a phone call versus an email? Is this parent only doing emails because that is just better for them, right? And they can use Google Translate or use something, a tool that they're able to communicate, right? So thank you, Yukio, because that is really, really important. Sharing
Right.
documents with families in their language, report cards, right? Report cards are important for families to understand. I don't know how many families I speak to that they've notified in their registration that they speak another language, but their report cards and everything still comes in English, right? How
Yeah.
can
And
we, go ahead.
yeah. So, and I also just want to add that, like, right, the way that school security is currently, um, you know, if your child signed a paper and they're off campus on a field trip,
Mhm,
right, and there's some incident at school and the parents are like, where is my child?
mhm,
They didn't know that they signed a permission slip to go off campus on a field trip, and parents are wondering, right, how safe is my child?
mhm.
So there's a lot of things that can come out of not understanding, all the information that's coming from a school.
Correct. Thank you. Thank you. And this is where, whether it's academic or equal educational opportunities, right? Because the field trips are equal educational opportunities, they're enrichment opportunities, right? And families need to be aware of all of those opportunities, because they can make informed decisions. What if Yukio had a medical condition that she needed a medication at a certain time, right? And she was away. I'm just throwing things out there, right? But I just think we need to understand the level of how important it is to send information to families in their language so that informed decisions are being made, and signatures, right? Thank you, Yukio. I did see something in the chat come up, but I can't oh no, I could. I'm not sharing my screen. Give me a second. So Marissa, districts often don't give families the ability to express. They speak multiple language. In our case, I had Mark one language, so I selected English, but I put pressure on me to interpret and translate everything for my husband who has limited English proficiency. I understand that. So that is a good segue to the next question I was going to ask Ada. So thank you for sharing that, Marissa. So Ada, I know that you mentioned your mom spoke English, right?
Yes.
But your dad
Not a
did not.
word.
So what did that mean for you, right? Because now I can see how districts would be like, well, mom speaks English, right? We're just gonna just speak English because mom can. But what does that mean if dad had to go to school or attend a meeting because mom was unavailable? Or what did that mean for you and your family?
It meant that I had one parent, that everything was addressed to mom and nothing was addressed. And in most cases, I don't know that anybody even knew that I had a father who actually dropped me off at school and picked me up, who was far more involved in some cases than my mother, who spoke English, that was working 2 to 3 jobs to support. Not that he wasn't, he was working also, but but she had more opportunities to find employment. But yeah, everything was addressed to her, and it's kind of funny. Yukio, your example, mine was, I was a senior. My mother actually, who spoke English, read it, signed my permission slip. So no, I did not sign my own for project graduation. So, and then that meant I stayed at night all night long at school. Well, long and behold, she didn't recognize the fact that that meant I really was staying at school all night long until 7 o'clock in the morning. So she started making phone calls. So this was before cell phones for everybody else, right? She started making phone calls to my friends' houses to figure out what in the world had happened to her child that was actually locked in school with the rest of her senior class. So just language sometimes does not mean actually understanding English, does not mean that you understand those other aspects of culture, right? The
Yes.
cultural expectations.
Yes.
I have no issues with my kids staying out all night at school this year. I understand what that means.
Yes. Thank you, Ala. Thank you. Thank you. And Marissa, thank you for sharing that in the chat, because it also lends, right? It just flowed into what Ada said, that if your husband is trying to be, right, an active member, right, not knowing the language, it's not like automatic, they're discounting him. It's like automatic, well, no, mom speaks English, so we're only gonna speak to mom, right? But that's not how it means. It means meaningful participation, and that is both parents, right? If both parents are there, then both parents need meaningful participation. So I thank you for sharing that that information. Now, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to read it. And that's exactly what happens. Thank you, Ada, for sharing.
I have lots of stories like that. So if anybody has more time, we're good.
Thank you. So I would like to circle back to some of the things. We can go back to the slide, but we don't have to necessarily go back to the slide. We have about 20 more minutes, and I wanted to give an opportunity to share out from not only the panelists that are here, right, but after what you've heard, right, if you can reflect and think about, for the panelists, I want you to think about what has worked, what hasn't worked, right? And if you can share that information, right? But for the other ones that are joining, I would like to ask you, and you can put it in the chat, what proactive, intentional strategies will you do to your practice as a result of today's discussion? So if you are a parent, right, what are you going to do differently now that we shared some information here? And if you are joining as a professional, please share what things you may consider and do differently now that you have this information. But I'm going to ask the panelists to please share out things that have worked, right? And then what didn't work, and how did that make you feel when it didn't work? So Lily, I'll let you go first because I saw that you were muted.
Yes, that was actually my favorite question. Like, I've never been asked that, so I got all excited. But what worked for me was having somebody like talk to me about what activities were going on, or even when it came to like work at school, it was helpful. And then what didn't work is I had this one accommodation in my IEP that never really got done. The only thing, like, I use what is called a slant board, so it's more elevated to where I can see. And it was supposed to be provided in every classroom. And I only got that in my special ed classroom, which made me kind of feel like I was being dismissed, I guess. But on the other side of having like help and being notified and everything with all the events, that was really helpful, and it made me very happy that people took the time to talk to me about it.
Thank you, Lily. Thank you. And as I can imagine that as a student, right? Because we're working with adults, it's like automatic. It's even harder to feel empowered to speak your voice, to share the things that you need, right? And then to not feel heard can feel like, oh, I have to do this again. Like you have to build up that strength to continue to do it every time, right? To ask, right? To sort of say, you have to build up the courage to ask again. And I could see how that is, right? It's tiring. But I do hope that more special education teachers are out there, like the one that you had that did listen and honor your request and make sure that she shared information with you and went that extra mile. But you have a voice. I remember one thing that you did say when we met was that I wish I was the me now then, right?
Yes, I
Because
do wish that all the time. Like, then I was this shy person that had to take the courage to say what she needed. But now that I've done everything that I've done this year, I wish I was that person then, because then I would have the guts to go back and be like, I needed this. We should have done this. Why didn't we?
thank you, Lily. Thank you. And I'm so glad that you have that voice now. Thank you.
Mm.
Anyone else?
I think for me, the not putting the onus on the students to be the interpreter, translator, the knowledge holder of what an American education system is for their parents. I think there's still tendencies for the school side to, especially when you get older, right, into middle school and high school, where just developmentally in an American school system, right, the students are responsible for self-advocate, being a self-advocate and knowing how to communicate when they need help. But that doesn't mean that even as a high school student who has more knowledge than like a third grader, doesn't mean that the students need to be that connection between home and school and home and teachers. It puts a lot of pressure. It could make that child parent relationship rockier, right? And even though they're high schoolers, they're still kids. We don't want to parentify, right, our teenagers. That's not their responsibility. So, I think on the school side, really understanding what resources are available to teachers and staff and faculty, everyone, to be able to communicate with families and how they can manage that system of trying to get interpreters, trying to get, paperwork translated will be so good.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Yukio.
I would say it's going to be so important that districts just utilize some of the staff that they have on hand. I mean, like I said, I worked in Hartford. I was there. I know other staff that spoke Albanian, spoke other languages. Utilize even just staff to provide that bridge and close that gap with the families is going to be very, very important. And Yuki, I'm with you. Let's not add one more thing to our kids. My kid was born and raised here. I find that it's difficult to just, as I'm helping her navigate and be more outspoken and self-advocate even in school, I can't imagine now adding one more thing to her plate to say, well, now you need to be the gap and bridge that gap between the school and me. Let's do this. Like, let's reverse the roles here. So sometimes it's just maybe focusing on what resources that are already in the buildings and in the districts and start there. There are lots of available resources, right? CPAC has tons of resources out there. There are language lines available for districts to use in those cases. Google Translate has done miracles with some of the basic stuff. It does miss the mark on quite a few other things. But there are at least something. It's a starting point. And the other piece too is coming from an interpreter. I went through interpreter training. It's interesting because depending on what you're getting trained in, it is the interpretation, the translations, everything is very specific to that field. It is not for other fields. So it's going to be so important that our interpreters in education understand education language and understand those acronyms and everything that come with that specific language. I still can't do, I can't translate, and when it comes to any other field other than the legal field, that I still got. Education, medical, all of those other, nope, will not even try. I will definitely miss the mark on that one. So, but I think this is where it's going to be important that we understand and we know and have that ability to come back and say, okay, where are we with it? What do we have?
Thank you, Ada. And I appreciate you bringing up that point in the sense that that there is training that goes along with being an interpreter, right? And using your staff is a great resource, and knowing when to use your staff, right? Being bilingual doesn't mean you can interpret, right? There's levels of language, right? And there's training that goes with being an interpreter. There's ethics that goes with being an interpreter, right? There's a code of ethics that you have to understand when you're being an interpreter. And sometimes if you're having staff interpret, that line gets muddy really quick, right? Adding opinions and feelings to interpretation is not appropriate. And having conversational language for a certain language, like, you know, someone picking up the phone, you need to speak to so and so, left your lunch bag, you know, your child left your lunch bag at home, or you know, a quick meeting with a teacher might be perfect, right, for that staff to be used. So you want to know where your staff is, and if that is offering them training so that they can better their interpretation skills, so that you can use them for other things, right? Like PPT meetings, discipline meetings. It is something that you're investing in your own, right? Paying for a training for that level so that you have someone within your district and school that you can use is something to think about. Rosa, if you'd like to share something that did work and didn't work, and then we'll have about 5 more minutes. Once you share out, if you can put it in the chat, whoever wants to put it in the chat now, or whoever wants to say something can put it, can raise their hand. But Lily does have that has a poem before we finish that she will be sharing.
Bueno, ya lo dije, pero tener el apoyo de CIPAC como intérprete hizo una gran diferencia. Yo tengo mis 2 hijas que son típicas, ellas no son una opción para ser intérprete porque obviamente son adolescentes, tienen sus propios mundos con sus propios problemas, y ponerles esa presión de que, oh, esta reunión salió mal porque tú no me interpretaste bien, o sea, es demasiado, o sea, no es justo. Entonces, ellas ya de por sí tienen otras historias que también yo tengo que prestar oído a ellas, porque entre los hijos aunque mi hijo tenga necesidades especiales y ellas no, ellas tienen necesidades que son especiales para mí, porque soy su madre. Y cuando no las escucho o les pongo presiones que no son de ellas, pues aumento mis problemas de los típicos adolescentes que ya tienen sus rebeldías o sus cuestionamientos. Entonces, pues hay que usar a las personas que están preparadas para esto, para ayudarnos en una forma profesional, para poder lograr lo que queremos, el objetivo que queremos, que es ayudar a nuestros hijos. Y eso es lo que a mí me funcionó.
Thank you, Rosa. Laura, if you can go back to the slide and go to slide, which one is this one? I can't see the number, but it's the one with the ducks. So here we have a leader duck or mama duck, papa duck, right? And the ducks following. So bottom line is when we know better, we do better, right? So now that we've shared these lived experiences, we hope that through this and the reflections and things that were shared that, right, you take this information and we change and progress to doing better. Nothing is perfect, so nothing will ever be perfect, but that we are moving and progressing. And can you put the QR code back on? I think the QR code is the next one. Skip that one. We already did it together as a group, so that's fine. And then this is the QR code. Is the same QR code that we had before. Is just what now that you've had the presentation, what comes to mind when you think about language access? Okay, if you can, just put a word that comes to mind. That'd be great. Then we are going to put Lily's poem on the screen. What's in the, okay. Okay, Lily.
Okay. The room hums with energy, words flowing like rivers, each one seeking a shore, a place to be understood, to be heard, truly heard. I sit, just not speaking, but translating lives, turning silence into words, barriers into bridges. It's not just about words, it's about stories, about the way someone's eyes light up when they realize they belong in a world of sounds, of connection. Nervousness lingers like a shadow, but it doesn't weigh me down. Because every voice that finds its way through this maze of language is a victory, a moment of hope. And isn't that why we're here? To give others the space to speak their truths in their own language and to make sure it reaches the hearts waiting on the other side.
Thank you, Lily. That was absolutely amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Okay. I will put up a poll. If everyone can please, I'm going to launch the poll. Lily, Jen says that that was beautiful. It was absolutely beautiful.
Thank you.
Here is a QR. I mean, I put the poll on. There is a QR code. For those of you that attended the session, you'll receive the slides, and there is a QR code with a toolkit for professionals and for families. The toolkit contains information about interpretation, translation services, how to plan ahead, how to be intentional. It provides parents with a letter asking or requesting for interpretation translation services, resources to use if they need things interpreted while they wait for something to be translated. So it has a lot of resources. So again, it has a professional toolkit and a family toolkit. Are there any questions? Jen said, thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to all the panelists. We appreciate you. We appreciate your time and taking the time to be with us today. I really enjoyed talking to you all and learning from you and your lived experience. So I really do appreciate all of you being here. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye, Alba.